I mean, back in the early 90s, there was somebody who bombed one of the Twin Towers, and it caused some damage. Maybe took a few lives, I can't remember, but it was a pretty big bomb. Maybe not quite as big as a huge flying bomb called an airplane, but yeah, I mean, really think that would collapse both towers if it was just the airplanes. So who could have been behind these other bombs planted at the base of both towers? And even the airplanes themselves. I mean, we have satellites, we have radio. When these so-called terrorists, I'm sure they were terrorists, it was orchestrated partially by that corrupt side of our government, or partially by that certain portion of the Taliban connected with whatever. They were terrorists, but how could our military not shoot these planes out of the sky? I mean, you know, the victims, or the poor victims aboard the airplanes, were toast once they were headed for the big city. But a lot of people were like, well, you know, they just couldn't have known at that last second. Okay, that's a possibility. But going back to my point of how did both towers collapse? How could these so-called terrorists get by with both hijacking their planes and planting bombs at the base of the towers, as if we have no type of security in this country? Okay? So, anyways, this act followed by a lot of clips of Arab Muslims and Arab people from Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East, Iraq and Iran, Saudi Arabia, holding up the American flag and burning the American flag and cheering as if they're cheering for this so-called great event. Now, come to find out as weeks go by, a couple months go by, those were actual clips from 2 years previous. And I'm not saying in certain parts of maybe Afghanistan or Pakistan there were some extremists that were cheering during this time, but that's the whole point I'm trying to make. So the whole devilish concept of excuse me, the whole devilish concept of you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs kind of comes into play. That fueled enough so-called justified rage and anger for the majority of American citizens and the American people as a whole to want to support the military and that other portion of our government and George W. Bush into going into an unjust war. Now, fighting against Afghanistan at first was to a certain degree, and then crossing over in the next year to Iraq, bringing up old beef between him and George Bush Sr., his pops, you know, between Saddam Hussein and, you know, so-called weapons of mass destruction. And even in the next year after this took place, I began to watch CNN and watch the news, how they would gradually, well, let's show an image of, oh, I'm sorry, that was an image of the Twin Towers. We put in the wrong tape. And now it's time to talk about weapons of mass destruction. It's kind of like, you know, when it's time to go back to war or put more troops in Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, you know, oh, we're in terrorist alert. There could be a possible terrorist strike. It's that fear factor or mind manipulation to kind of support an unjust cause. And really, the actual fall of Babylon being right here in America, or the U.S. government, right here in Mystery Babylon, was already collapsing before this literal collapse of this building took place. It was an economical collapse because of expending. Too much in spending, not enough expending, or whatever, going in debt, just being the great whore, you know, just kind of mooching and sucking blood off other countries, other nations, but still somehow being the most powerful nation in the world. It kind of makes you think. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Yehoshua.
But that tower's not there anymore.
And these unjust wars, excuse me, these unjust wars in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East that have caused so much innocent bloodshed of innocent Arab Muslim people and even U.S. soldiers who were just over there, you know, called for duty, doing what they had to do. Their poor wives and children over here in American soil never got to see them. It's caused a lot of innocent bloodshed on both sides, even innocent civilians. The majority of innocent civilians were good, innocent, true Muslim people that believe in peace and righteousness, just like true Christians, that were killed and bombed, their houses being bombed and killed, caught up in the crossfire of this unjust war and all that prejudice that rose up after this time. I had an ex-girlfriend who was Indian, and she got dirty looks because so many Americans can't tell the difference between Indians and Arabs. And even if she was Arab, you know, you're gonna generalize Arab, Muslims, or whatever color Muslims with terrorism because of this one thing. This is how they manipulate and even create hatred and prejudice towards Muslims. Just like we talked about in the previous segment, you know, subliminal hatred or prejudice towards Christians, generalizing all Christians instead of some Christians. You know, true Muslims are not terrorists, but they make us think that they are through propaganda, through mind control. These so-called prejudice terms like raghead or towelhead, you know, they don't realize that the turban is a spiritual thing. Even with true original Christians, the true Ethiopian Orthodox Christians and the first Hebrew Israelites and the original Jews, just like Muslims, wore that same attire. The turban is a very spiritual thing, and that's just an ignorant comment to make. I feel sorry for all the true Muslims over here in America around that time. Even today, people still jump the gun, and they can just bring up 9/11 to rejuvenate that so-called hatred and prejudice. You see, people don't do their research. You know, so-called Christians, that the original first century Christians, the first Messianic Hebrew Israelites and Messianic Jews, just like Rastafari brethren, especially the Ababa Shanti Rastafari, that wear the turban over their head. You know, that's a very spiritual thing. And once again, going back to the actual images, or the horrifying image of this collapse, is a very horrible thing. There's no doubt about that. There's no way to rationalize how horrible it really was, and how horrible even 10 years later it still is. But we look on behalf of the majority over the past 8-9 years of innocent victims, U.S. soldiers and people in the Middle East that were innocent victims caught up in this unjust war for money and power, establishment, for land and oil. Why? Because America has to find some other resources to keep their money going. Our country is so far in debt. That's why in this past 9 years since the collapse of these towers, a major source or central source of our economical metropolis, has caused this gradual downfall of our economy. And especially now, in the year 2010, under this so-called recession and stimulant plan by our new president. But my point is this: how long will it take for more people to wake up and stop being sheepish in this nation?
Of the World Trade Center, we understand that one of the Twin Towers has collapsed entirely.
Now, this terrible event also gives fuel not just for unjust war, but to support Zionism and the oppression of Arab Muslim people and even true Israeli Jews who are actual Jews caught up in the mix. You know, it's a shame because in modern corporate Christianity, especially for the past couple of decades, has supported just the Israeli Jews, And really, the Ethiopian Jews have been there for centuries. But just now, certain forms of corporate Christianity is just now warming up to that.